Hey there, Powderkeg friends and Unvalley attendees. I'm Matt Hunkler, the CEO and founder of Powderkeg. And in this session, we're going to talk all about building a peer and mentor support network. And it's with someone who has achieved so much in her career. I'm very excited to have her here because she is a leader in not only the Cincinnati tech community and in the Midwest, but all over the world, focusing on investing on underrepresented founders. Candice Matthews Brackeen is a general partner at Lightship Capital, a $50+ million fund focused on investing in non-traditional areas. Non-traditional in the sense that it is focused primarily on some very underserved groups. They invest solely in early stage companies led by Black, Indigenous, people of color, LGBTQ+, women, and people with disabilities who are operating in the CPG, e-commerce, sustainability, artificial intelligence, and healthcare spaces. This is a pre-recorded conversation, which means it's a particularly good convo to be able to connect here at Unvalley. So I want to invite you right now to go ahead and introduce yourself in the comments. We've got people from all over the country, including Cincinnati and the Midwest, but actually all over the world, we have people tuning in. So go ahead right now and drop your LinkedIn URL in the comments. Introduce yourself, where you're from, what you're focused on. This is a good time to kind of get introduced as we kick things off with Candice Matthews Brackeen. We talk all about her career from a founder to starting an accelerator program to founding Lightship Capital this year. And making just such a huge impact in the Midwest and all over the world, really. So I hope you enjoy this as much as I did. There's a lot to get out of it. Get your notebooks out. I've got all my notes from this conversation I just recorded. So I hope you enjoy this, and let's dive right in. Candice, thanks so much for being here. Where are you tuning in from today?
I'm from Cincinnati.
Awesome. Well, good to have another Midwesterner here at Unvalley. I know a lot of people are really eager to learn from you and get connected with everything that's going on. A lot of really exciting things that you're involved with right now. And I mentioned those in the intro. And of course, we'll get there. But I would love to just first start by kind of taking a step back and saying, how did you first get into tech in the first place?
Oh, goodness. So it's not been that long. So about 6 years ago, my gosh, I guess maybe now almost 7 years ago, my oldest son was invited out on a play date. It wasn't the best situation. And I realized in those moments that I should have set more expectations. So it was around that same time that I started a company, a tech company called Hello Parent. It was just a mobile app to help parents connect and organize activities. And I went through a local accelerator here. So that was my first entry point into tech.
When you started that company, what was it that made you take the leap and say, you know what, I have had this idea. I'm actually going to take action on it and go. Have you always been that way?
I've always been this way. Yeah. I've absolutely always been this way. This isn't my, second company, third company. This is number 7 of things that I've started. But I mean, I'm also over 40, so things can happen in a career. But yeah, no, I've absolutely always been this way.
In that initial kind of ideating and launching phase, how did you, when you kind of launched, were there any people that were particularly helpful, and how did you go about finding those people?
At the time, we hadn't properly labeled what we now call Startup Cincy. But there was kind of the skeleton of Startup Cincy here in Cincinnati back then. So I started attending kind of local meetups, and the Brandery was one of those locations that had a meetup. And so I started attending those. And at the time, their managing director there was like, to start navigating the ecosystem. I didn't even know what that meant at the time. Like, what's the ecosystem? Like, I remember that from grade school and studying that, but like, there's a tech ecosystem. I don't understand. So it was those people that really helped me to start navigating the local tech scene.
When you were first kind of getting plugged in and finding those people, were there any mistakes that you made or later kind of realized, oh, I could have done that better in sort of how I was plugging in? Or even now today, when you're suggesting to a founder, how do you get plugged in? What are some of the things that you tell them to prioritize in the way that they're engaging with a new tech community?
Ooh, okay, so this is a lot of do as I say, not as I do. But, you know, I think a lot of people said to me, like, not every meeting is going to be a good meeting. Um, but also, in my opinion, every meeting leads to something else, right?
Mm.
And so I think just from a networking perspective, I took everything that I possibly could, um, even when I didn't know where they were going to go to.
Yeah.
Um, and some of those relationships that I've started building, 6, 7 years ago are meaningful today. The people who told me no then are my partners throughout this tech ecosystem. So really early on, Mike Venerable from Cincy Tech told me no, right? But as I started to build the fund that we'll talk about in a little bit, he's been my, greatest ally. So I think that we just don't know what's going to happen in those moments. So anyone navigating, trying to build a network, it's really just learning and listening and not expecting to get anything out of it at that moment.
That's a great perspective, and I can't wait to talk about that. Mike is such a prolific person here in the Midwest, investing in so many startups, and it's great to hear that you two are collaborating on what you're doing now with Lightship, which I'm so excited about. Are there things that you can do? You mentioned every meeting leads to something else. Are there things that you do in a meeting, or you recommend to founders do in a meeting, to open up greatest opportunity for a continued relationship or that next connection, or that next potential collaboration down the road?
I'm a big note taker, like physically taking notes. And if I probably plugged in, my situation back here. So I keep a stack of the same brand notebook, and at every single meeting, I'm writing down who I talked to, what the topic was, and all my action items at the bottom. And, I'm buying these same things over and over. This is an unused one, and so I'm writing notes and thinking about what could this person link to at another time. And I can always go back in time to those people. So, who was that? Okay, well, it was around this time, and I can flip through and find it. Because you don't know in those moments, like I said before, how things are going to connect. And sometimes it can take 2 days. Sometimes it could take 2 years to figure out how one thing connects to another thing. So for me, my kind of like pro tip is actually like a physically written notebook.
I'm the same way. I'm absolutely the same way. Are there things you do as a habit, or maybe this is a do as I say, not as I do as well? Because I definitely have those too. In terms of follow up after a meeting.
If I'm being honest, I'm not great at it, but I have a team, right? So after my meetings, I typically debrief certain meetings with my chief of staff.
Mm-hmm.
And she is fantastic at the follow up, because for me, it's constant meetings. Like 2 or 3 weeks ago, I think I had 39 meetings in 1 week, right? So that's like, it's an impossible task.
Right.
So we're tag teaming the responses. But it's important to follow up. You'd be surprised how many opportunities are lost that way.
You mentioned chief of staff. Talk to me a little bit about how that has changed your network and what you do just day to day, being involved in so many different startups, and knowing now so many different people as well.
Yeah, for us, that's so necessary. I think in the beginning it was like just somebody to help with scheduling, and now it's like somebody who can also think with me throughout the day and can see what's happening kind of in real time, like air traffic control amongst the other teams that work with us. So yeah, it's changed a lot over the last 6 years, from Hello Parent to Hillman, and now in addition to that, Lightship.
So take me back to Hello Parent. What lessons did you learn through that adventure, and how did that ultimately result for you?
Oh goodness. So it was an adventure. It was for certain an adventure. Oh my gosh. I learned about what you spend money on first in a company, right? I think that a lot of early tech companies, we pay for the hype before we've paid for the product. So we focus more on marketing than we shouldn't have, right? And not so much on the product. We should have brought the dev team in-house earlier than we did. That should have been in-house the entire time. Outsourced development in our particular space just wasn't going to work for me, because I also didn't know how to manage the product. So hiring a product manager would have been helpful early on. What else would I have changed? I would have raised more money. I think in the beginning I thought, oh, I won't need that much. Anything else? Oh my gosh. I just think it's a learning process, right? Your first tech company is not always going to be the win. Just like, I mean, some folks get the win, but a lot of folks don't. So no, I think that's my kind of initial read of it.
You mentioned raise more money. Having been through that a couple of different times, some with my own companies, some with companies where I was either leading product or marketing. And before you do it, $1 million feels like all the money in the world. And then when you get into the trenches running a startup, you realize just how far $1 million can go. And it can go fast, it can go slow. And it really depends on how you operate the business. But certainly finding those investors, those believers early on is probably one of the biggest hurdles that a founder can overcome. What were some of the challenges you faced, and what were some of the lessons you learned through that process?
Oh, well, that I didn't have the network to support it. I definitely learned that pretty early on. Like there were tons of people who were excited for me, I think, more than anything, for me to build this product, but were there enough investors to do it? So I would say that definitely was an issue. And I think a lot of founders, struggle to find the right investor. They hear investor and they assume they invest in all things, right?
Yep.
So figuring out who was helping in that particular focus area. For us, it was parent tech. Like, are there very many groups that invest in tech for parents? Not many. I think that this is a struggle. We struggle on our own without the technology to support it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. That's definitely a good lesson to learn. So for founders that don't have that network, what advice do you have for them in order to find their first investor, their first couple potential investors even?
So plugging into the local ecosystem or national ecosystem. So there's lots of folks that are kind of building networks nationally. There are folks that are doing it locally. So I think throughout the Midwest, there are lots of organizations that are providing support. And it depends on the city that you're in, just how robust that's going to be. I know that some of the ecosystems in the Midwest, like ours in Cincinnati, I feel like we're pretty well coordinated. I know the folks in Wisconsin do a fantastic job too. The Chicago ecosystem. So I think smaller towns sometimes are now just starting to grow theirs. It's the larger hubs that are doing really well. But I think that, each city in the Midwest is trying their hardest to make their ecosystem the best in the Midwest.
Well, and you shifted gears after Hello Parent into being one of those organizations that is so critical to the ecosystem in Cincinnati and beyond with Hillman Accelerator. Can you talk to me about how you decided to go from your startup into, what was that transition like, going from startup entrepreneur into accelerator entrepreneur?
Yeah. So while I had Hello Parent, I did struggle to find my niche in the tech ecosystem. And, not many people were trying to hang out at tech meetup groups with this kind of like 35-ish-year-old Black mom. Like it just wasn't a thing. So I started a meetup group called the Black Founders Network here locally in June of 2015. And Hello Parent probably closed up toward the end of the year that year, maybe early 2016. And it was kind of that group that helped to launch Hillman. So the first month there was 11 of us. That first group of 11 has raised about $115 million in venture capital for our own projects and companies over the last 5 years. It was that group that got us started. So by the fifth month, we were 75 founders, funders, and friends. And it continued to grow. And it was just a calendar invite I sent out every month for pizza and beer or wine and cheese. And Some months we talked about business, and some months it was really social, and we'd go to local kind of arcades or bowling or whatever. So it was that helped us to launch Hillman. It was the conversations that we were having about enterprise sales and raising funds that people were like, oh, wait, nobody's having this conversation about maybe sometimes how difficult it is as a Black person raising venture. It was around the same time that Project Diane had come out mentioning that, less than 1% of venture capital goes to Black-led companies. So it was really a great moment in time for us to get started. And so that's how the transition happened.
I love that story because I think it highlights one of the strengths of the Cincy tech ecosystem, but also just a lot of tech ecosystems in the middle of the country, which is that if you don't find your people immediately, you can put a flag out there and say, hey, I'm creating this group for this. And people will show up. And that initiative, if you've got that spark like you do, creating that ecosystem is certainly not easy, or that group is certainly not easy. But I have seen it happen time and time again, where someone says, I wish this existed. I'm going to go ahead and create it. And they tap into an unmet need, which you certainly did with everything with the Black Founders Group that led into an accelerator, that led into, I'm sure, in some way to what you're doing now with Lightship Capital. Talk to me about how that early energy then moved into starting an accelerator program.
Yeah, because initially we thought we wanted to build a pre-accelerator, some way for Black and brown women founders to get into the local accelerators, because at that moment, there wasn't much representation. So that was kind of the initial idea. Yeah. Then what we realized is that that wasn't going to make a large enough impact. There may be 1 or 2 people a year, but how can we start getting to more? And so it was that energy that pushed and propelled us forward. Also around the same time, the state of Ohio's Ohio Third Frontier program came out with an RFP for grassroots efforts looking to grow the Black and brown tech ecosystems throughout the state of Ohio. So myself and my co-founders for Hillman, we submitted to that RFP and won the Cincinnati region's pot of money. So our initial grant from the state for 3 years was $175,000 a year. We found match, and that got us off the ground for our pilot.
That's amazing. That's amazing. I love that story because that initial spark that you followed and didn't hesitate on led to so much growth in other ways, and planted so many seeds for new startups and new entrepreneurs and people to plug into those companies. Can you talk a little bit about what you learned in growing Hillman Accelerator that might help people better understand how to navigate tech ecosystems and grow their startup from an area outside of Silicon Valley or New York City?
Oh, so I just think that this is the story of the little engine that could, right? So it was a lot of like, fake it till you make it and just believing in ourselves over the last few years. So we started with very little money. It was very difficult to find the match for the state. And so we just didn't quit. I think that's the story. It's the story of just like not quitting. As we started the Black Founders Network, it was a calendar invite every month. And every month we made it happen. The same thing with Hillman. It's just like plugging through, applying for grants, finding people who were interested, but then knowing that the network was there the entire time, right? You do customer discovery, you know what your customers want, Matt. I know who my customers are, but how do I relay that to my partners or investors, or in this case, lots of foundations? So it's, over the last few years, we've just figured out how to speak to both groups. And we've stayed the course the entire time. So it's been a lot of time spent on not quitting and knowing deep in our souls through quantitative and qualitative data that this is an area that needs to be served. When we first started it in 2017, people are like, okay, this is novel. 2018, okay, this is still a little novel. 2019, oh, wow, they've stayed the course. This is going to continue. 2020, suddenly people realize why. Why did they stay the course? Why? Because there's some really messed up stuff in the world that needs to be corrected. And thank goodness organizations like ours and others have stayed the course. It's because we understood qualitatively and quantitatively, and it took until this year for people to see bad things happen to good people. And so I think that that's the, that's the lesson for founders is, don't quit, listen to your customers, figure out a way to speak to the investor in your network. And at some point, the proof point will show up to the world for them to see.
I love that call to action. And I think has so many applications even beyond founders. You think about people looking for their dream job and finding that place where they can really find that right match with the right culture and thrive in their career. And it's sort of just having those conversations, building those networks will pay off. And you truly stayed the course. Talk to me a little bit about what happened this year with your career and how that helped really all of the things that you've already done, how you were able to take those resources and galvanize that into even more momentum for what you're already focused on.
Yeah, I mean, we've been prepared for this moment. And I think that everything that we've planned every year, so at the end of every fiscal year, for us, it's the end of the calendar year, we take a step back and we look at the impact that we had during that year and how we can continue beyond that. And at the end of last year, expansion was our goal, right? And, March hit and it seemed as if that could never, ever happen. But the contracts that we were working on, those folks didn't want to stop, just like we didn't want to stop. And so we were able to kind of hit our monetary expansion goals so that in 2021, though we wanted to actually physically reside in other cities this year, it couldn't happen. But, that's what we've been able to do is we've been able to kind of continue with the momentum. As we've grown Hillman and now Lightship Capital, it's really just been all about, pushing forward, not quitting, and not assuming that people want to quit, right? I think that this year, a lot of us believed that the world was truly going to stand still.
Yep.
And I think for about maybe 6 weeks it did, right? But beyond that, it did not. Right. And so we didn't give anyone the out unless they wanted it out. And we just continued to power through it. And there have been plenty of times where I've wanted to quit. Other members of the team have wanted to quit on a certain project. And one of us is like, no, we're just going to keep going. And if I'm being completely honest, and he's somewhere in this house, my spouse, Brian, is also my business partner. And he's typically the one that never gives anyone an out and has been a huge cheerleader for all of this. But I think that lots of folks have been prepared, at least in the Black tech ecosystem, the minority tech ecosystems, for these moments. We've been doing this work the whole time. And we're just using this year as kind of a bonus year because we know that come next year, the same energy may not be here for causes for people that look like me. But here we are in this moment right now.
Were you able to find peers and mentors throughout this big shift? Obviously, no one's navigated through a pandemic before, but unless you're over 100 years old, how did you go about kind of finding that support system around you to do it as you were doing it?
I think that the network, so I always bring this back to Mike Venerable. Most people know that I'm just his biggest fan. But as I said before, it's like sticking with the network you have and growing and fostering that relationship. So I think that that's what's happened a lot for us this year is growing those particular relationships. But we've also spent time with folks we've been introduced to this year. There's been a lot of like new Zoom friends, right? Where we spend lots of times with people in our kitchens or living rooms. So it's just been not missing those meetings more than anything, and spending time on Zoom and trying to figure out like, how do we make it authentic? Difficult to do. And sometimes there are days where we hit our 10th Zoom call and we're not really that into it. But you have to kind of give your entire energy to it every time. I think it's just been a really weird and difficult year. But you have to treat all of these things as authentic meetings.
You mentioned stick with the network you have and nurture those relationships. What are some of the ways that you've nurtured your own relationships, or that you recommend other founders nurture their relationships over time?
For us, we're all about breaking bread. So like actually eating meals with people. We do that in one of our programs called New Me. So it's a boot camp where we bring 10 founders into a house and we live together. I cannot wait to do them again next year. And it's in those moments where we, I think, create our most authentic relationships. Having coffee, eating a meal, I think has huge impact on how our relationship grows. I think many of us remember summer camp and how we felt at the end of the week or month that we were there, and feeling like we could just die without those people in our lives, right? And so I think that those are the things that we have to do with people. We have to figure out how do we break bread with them virtually and in person, so that we can better understand each other as humans. I think that has been what's helpful this year, is being able to hear people's children run around, or their dogs barking, or their spouse walking behind them. That's what has made this all bearable, is seeing that everyone is just a human in their own spaces.
I couldn't agree more, and want to use this opportunity to encourage people to, if they haven't already, introduce themselves in the comments here, ask questions, see how we can get connected, because this community, these tech communities outside the coast are getting more and more interconnected every day. Thanks in no small part to groups like Hillman Accelerator and Lightship Capital. Do you mind just speaking a little bit, Candice, about Lightship Capital and what you're doing there today, and how the Unvalley community can help support that?
Oh, certainly. So Lightship Capital is a $50 million fund focused on supporting underrepresented founders. So those are Black, Indigenous, people of color, LGBTQIA+, and those that are disabled. And so just people who are typically overlooked in venture capital here in the Midwest, so the center of the country. And we invest in 5 sectors: so consumer packaged goods and services, e-commerce, sustainability, AI, and healthcare. And how can people get involved? I mean, really just following our portfolio, and all those companies can be found on our website.
Awesome. And we'll link it up here in the comments as well. Thank you so much, Candice, for being a part of this. And thanks for everything that you do that helps tech entrepreneurs and the entire tech ecosystem all over the country.
Awesome. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.